Beneath the historic streets of New Orleans, in the shadow of grand mansions and old plantations, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Workers and archaeologists kept uncovering buried boxes hidden under the remnants of slave quarters, places where generations of enslaved people had lived and suffered. At first these discoveries seemed random, almost accidental, but as more boxes were unearthed, an unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. Every single box contained the same haunting contents. What was inside these boxes, and why were they buried in the same manner across different sites? The answer paints a grim and mysterious picture of the lives, fears, and resistance of those who were forced to live in bondage, leaving behind secrets that the city would struggle to comprehend for decades. In the historic city of New Orleans, a city steeped in layers of history both vibrant and harrowing, archaeologists, historians, and even construction workers began to notice a pattern that defied simple explanation. Over the course of several decades, during routine excavations, renovations, and sometimes accidental discoveries while digging foundations for new buildings, objects kept appearing that were not part of any ordinary archaeological record. Beneath the worn and weathered foundations of what were once slave quarters, small, carefully buried boxes kept being unearthed. These boxes were not hidden haphazardly or scattered randomly across sites. Rather, they seemed deliberately concealed beneath the floors, in corners, under hearths, and sometimes even beneath piles of discarded refuse that had accumulated over decades. Each discovery seemed to echo the last, creating a thread of continuity that suggested a deliberate practice among those who had lived and labored in these quarters. The first reports of such findings came from local historians in the mid-20th century, who were surveying old plantation sites along the outskirts of the French Quarter and deeper into the neighborhoods that had historically housed enslaved populations. Workers would uncover fragments of wood, iron hinges, and the occasional decayed cloth, only to realize that these were remnants of small sealed boxes. Upon careful excavation, these boxes revealed that they were more than mere containers. They were intentional repositories, hidden with care and with thought to secrecy and protection. The placement under floors or in hidden compartments within the structures suggested a sense of urgency and discretion, indicating that those who buried these boxes did so with full awareness that they were leaving behind objects meant to endure without being discovered, or at least not immediately. Each box unearthed brought with it questions about the lives of the enslaved people who had once inhabited these spaces. The sheer consistency of finding boxes under slave quarters, rather than in other parts of the property such as kitchens, stables, or storage areas, indicated a profound connection between the people and the places they called their homes. However cruelly constrained those homes were, the quarters themselves, often cramped, poorly ventilated, and built from materials that would decay over decades, were unlikely candidates for long-term storage of valuable items in the eyes of their owners. This fact only deepened the mystery. The enslaved people were hiding these boxes under conditions that were constantly at risk of discovery, and yet they did so repeatedly across multiple locations, as if following a practice passed down or shared widely among the enslaved communities of New Orleans. The contents of these boxes varied, but the act of burying them in the first place revealed layers of human psychology and cultural practice. Some of the earliest discoveries included items that might appear mundane to outsiders: coins, scraps of cloth, beads, or small tools. Yet careful study showed that these were not randomly selected objects. Each piece was chosen with purpose, often imbued with personal, spiritual, or symbolic meaning. The coins might represent a small measure of wealth, autonomy, or future hope. The beads and trinkets could serve as reminders of family, homeland, or cultural identity. The tools, though simple, could symbolize resilience and the ability to maintain control over one's own life in a society that sought to strip that control away. In many ways, the act of burying these items was as significant as the items themselves, representing a quiet but resolute assertion of agency, memory, and survival. As archaeologists continued to uncover these boxes, patterns emerged, not just in their placement but also in their construction. Many boxes were made of wood, often scavenged or repurposed from larger crates or furniture, and carefully sealed with nails, pitch, or other materials designed to protect their contents from moisture and decay. The skill with which some of these boxes were assembled suggested that the creators had experience in carpentry, or at least a keen understanding of how to preserve objects over time. This attention to detail further underscored the significance of what was inside. These were not casual stashes forgotten or abandoned. They were deliberate efforts to safeguard something meaningful. The repeated discovery of these boxes under slave quarters rather than elsewhere on the property indicated that the enslaved people had an intimate understanding of their environment, knowing where to hide something so it would remain secret from overseers, owners, or even later occupants. Beyond their physical characteristics, the locations of these boxes revealed much about the daily lives and spatial awareness of enslaved communities. Floors of the quarters, often made from planks spaced loosely to allow ventilation or to make cleaning easier, provided both opportunity and challenge for hiding objects. Some boxes were found beneath floorboards that had been lifted and replaced, suggesting that the act of burying was accompanied by subtle alterations to the living space. Others were hidden in pits or small cavities beneath hearths or near corners where the movement of inhabitants was limited, areas that would not be routinely disturbed. This careful placement indicated not only practical ingenuity but also an understanding of human behavior. The enslaved people knew where others would and would not look, and they used this knowledge to protect what they valued. The repeated discovery of these boxes across different sites and time periods points to a shared cultural practice rather than isolated incidents. Scholars began to speculate that the burial of boxes under slave quarters may have been part of a tradition carried from Africa modified to the circumstances of life in New Orleans. The practice could have served multiple purposes: safeguarding personal or communal possessions, creating spiritual or protective caches, or even as a form of resistance, leaving behind a record or legacy that could outlast the brutal conditions of slavery. In each case, the boxes serve as a testament to the resilience, creativity, and foresight of those who made them, offering a tangible link to lives that were systematically oppressed and marginalized. Furthermore, the discovery of these boxes under slave quarters often sparked public and academic interest precisely because they challenged assumptions about the material and emotional lives of enslaved people. Traditional histories had long focused on plantations, large-scale production, and the economic dimensions of slavery, often neglecting the intimate spaces where enslaved individuals created private worlds and protected their identity. The repeated appearance of buried boxes directly under the quarters forces a re-evaluation. These were not simply passive victims of circumstance, they were active participants in shaping their environment, maintaining cultural practice, and asserting control over aspects of their lives that remained their own, however constrained by the institution of slavery. Over time, as more discoveries were documented, a narrative began to emerge in which these boxes were not isolated curiosities, but integral components of understanding the lived experience of enslaved people in New Orleans. Each unearthing was a reminder that the city's history was layered and complex, that beneath the streets, the sidewalks, and the buildings lay not just physical artifacts but traces of thought, memory, and intention. The fact that these boxes were consistently found under slave quarters rather than in other areas emphasizes the human element behind the practice. These were intimate gestures rooted in personal spaces and private lives, enacted with care and deliberation. In this sense, the boxes function as a bridge between past and present, allowing modern observers to glimpse the strategies, hopes, and spiritual or emotional concerns of those who lived through one of the most brutal chapters in human history. As archaeologists, historians, and local researchers continued to uncover buried boxes beneath the remnants of slave quarters in New Orleans, a startling pattern began to emerge. Every single box contained the same mysterious types of item. While initially the discoveries might have seemed random or coincidental, the uniformity of their contents across different locations and time periods became impossible to ignore. It was as if an unspoken, unwritten tradition had guided the enslaved people in selecting and placing these objects, creating a series of consistent artifacts that transcended individual households or plantations. The phenomenon suggested not only intentionality but also a shared understanding among the enslaved community about what these boxes should contain, why they should be buried, and how they should serve the people who created them. The first challenge faced by researchers was to catalog and identify the items within these boxes. Many of the contents were surprisingly well preserved, despite decades or even centuries of burial beneath dirt, floorboards, and debris. Small personal objects, beads, coins, jewelry fragments, buttons, and scraps of cloth appeared with striking regularity. To the casual observer, these items might seem inconsequential, even mundane. Yet to the enslaved people who had carefully collected, preserved, and buried them, these objects carried profound meaning. They were tangible pieces of identity, markers of personal history, and in some cases tools of spiritual practice. The repetition of these items in each box suggested a standardized symbolic language, a set of objects that communicated values, beliefs, and priorities, even without written records to explain them. Among the most common contents were small charms, amulets, or talismans made from natural materials, metal or beads. These items, often intricately crafted or assembled with care, seemed to serve protective or ritualistic purpose. Anthropologists and historians noted that many of these charms bore striking similarities to West and Central African spiritual traditions, which had been carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people. Such objects might have been intended to protect the individual or the household, to ward off evil spirits, or to ensure the safety of loved ones. The recurrence of these spiritual or protective items in every box highlighted the persistence of cultural memory, demonstrating that even under the extreme conditions of slavery, African traditions and beliefs remained alive, transmitted through material culture and hidden practice. In addition to charms and ritual objects, the boxes frequently contained personal items of sentimental or practical value: beads, buttons, Small trinkets, coins, scraps of fabric, and tiny pieces of jewelry were common, and often carefully arranged or wrapped to preserve them from decay. Each object told a story of the individual or family who had buried it. Coins, for instance, may have represented hope for a future escape or symbolized the accumulation of small personal wealth in a society that sought to strip enslaved people of autonomy and property. Buttons and beads, while seemingly ordinary, could have served as reminders of family, home, or cultural identity, connecting the buried items to a larger sense of self in a world determined to erase individuality. The meticulous care with which these objects were collected and hidden underscored the emotional and symbolic significance of each box, suggesting that the act of burying was itself an assertion of agency and dignity. Another striking feature of the boxes was their remarkable consistency across different locations. Whether unearthed from a small urban dwelling in the French Quarter or a sprawling plantation on the outskirts of the city, the contents remained largely uniform: personal artifacts, protective charms, ritual objects, and small items of monetary or sentimental value. This pattern indicated more than coincidence. It suggested a shared cultural practice, or a set of unwritten rules that guided enslaved communities in deciding what to place in these hidden repositories. Oral histories, when available, hinted at similar practices being taught and transmitted from one generation to the next, emphasizing the importance of continuity and communal knowledge even in the face of systemic oppression. The repetition of contents also raised questions about the purpose of these boxes. Were they intended as caches for future retrieval, left behind for family members or descendants? Were they spiritual offerings, acts of faith or devotion meant to safeguard the living or honor the dead? Or were they tools of resistance meant to preserve cultural identity and personal agency in a society that denied enslaved people both? Scholars speculated that the answer was likely a combination of all three. The fact that the same types of items appeared consistently across multiple boxes reinforced the idea that these objects were more than possessions. They were symbols, carriers of meaning, and anchors for memory and resilience. In essence, the boxes were not simply containers. They were repositories of identity, culture, and hope preserved beneath the very structures that had confined their creators. The methodology of burial also reflected careful planning and forethought. Boxes were often sealed meticulously, wrapped in cloth or layers of organic material to protect their contents from moisture, pests, and decay. Some were placed under floorboards, while others were hidden in small pits beneath hearth, in corners, or near foundation. The consistency of both the contents and the method of concealment suggested a deliberate system, perhaps transmitted orally among the enslaved, ensuring that each box fulfilled its intended purpose and remained undisturbed for as long as possible. The act of burial itself, repeated across generations and locations, became a form of ritual, embedding meaning into the very act of hiding and preserving these items. The uniformity of the contents also revealed insights into the psychological and emotional world of enslaved people. In a society designed to strip them of autonomy, dignity, and identity, the creation of these boxes represented a measure of control, a space where enslaved people could determine what was valuable, meaningful, and worth preserving. Each box was a statement of existence, a refusal to let life, memory, and culture be erased. Even under constant surveillance, extreme hardship, and the threat of violence, the act of selecting, arranging, and burying these objects allowed enslaved individuals to assert a sense of agency, to claim a form of ownership over their own stories and legacy. The consistent contents emphasized that this was not an isolated or incidental practice. It was a deeply ingrained cultural behavior that sustained community memory and identity in the face of oppression. As modern researchers continue to study these boxes, the uniformity of their contents provides a powerful lens through which to understand the lives of those who lived in bondage. Every discovery reinforces the idea that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were active participants in preserving their cultural heritage, protecting their families, and asserting personal and communal agency through material culture. The boxes speak to resilience, hope, and the determination to endure, even when circumstances were unimaginably harsh. By examining the repeated patterns in what these boxes contained, historians and archaeologists gain insight not only into the practicalities of life under slavery but also into the spiritual and emotional dimensions that often go unrecorded in traditional historical documents. The deliberate hiding of buried boxes beneath the slave quarters of New Orleans did not occur haphazardly. The care and intentionality with which these objects were concealed point to a practice steeped in meaning, strategy, and force. From the moment a box was prepared, it was clear that those who buried it understood the risks and significance of their actions. The locations chosen for concealment were far from arbitrary. Floorboards were lifted, pits were dug, corners were selected where human traffic was minimal, and in some cases, objects were buried beneath hearth or other structural elements that offered both cover and protection. This was not the behavior of someone casually stashing possessions.
It was a deliberate act performed with thought, precision, and a deep awareness of the surrounding environment, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of secrecy and survival. The repeated discovery of boxes in these hidden locations across multiple sites strongly suggests that the enslaved people who created them shared knowledge of where to hide valuables and meaningful objects. The choice of placement was inherently strategic. Floors offered concealment but were accessible enough to allow retrieval, while corners and pits minimized the likelihood of accidental discovery. Some boxes were hidden beneath layers of debris, ash, or even under other mundane items, cleverly camouflaging their existence. This method of concealment was both practical and symbolic. Practical in that it protected objects from damage or theft. Symbolic in that it demonstrated an ability to exercise control over one's environment, asserting a form of autonomy within the strict confines of slavery. Careful analysis of these buried boxes indicates that their placement was sometimes influenced by spiritual or protective beliefs. Certain areas beneath the quarters, such as under the hearth or near doorways, held symbolic significance in various African and Afro-Caribbean traditions. The hearth, for example, was often seen as the heart of the home, a center of warmth, sustenance, and protection. Placing a box beneath the hearth could signify a desire to protect the household, safeguard the spirits of family members, or ensure continuity and safety for those who lived there. Likewise, hidden corners or thresholds might have been chosen for their liminal qualities, spaces that in many cultural belief systems are associated with transition, protection, or communication with the spiritual. These choices reveal that the act of burial was not purely functional, but also deeply intertwined with cultural knowledge, ritual practice, and spiritual significance. The process of burying these boxes required ingenuity and skill. Many were constructed to endure moisture, soil, and wood, metal, and other available materials were carefully shaped, sealed, and reinforced. Cloth or natural fibers were often used to wrap or cushion the contents, protecting fragile items from decay. The labor involved in crafting these boxes, coupled with the need to transport, conceal, and later possibly retrieve them, demonstrates a high level of resourcefulness. This was an act that required both planning and execution, under circumstances where the enslaved people had extremely limited freedom and faced constant surveillance. The very act of hiding such objects can be understood as an assertion of agency, an exercise of control over one's own cultural and personal legacy, despite living under conditions designed to strip away autonomy. Historians and archaeologists have noted that the intentionality of these burials also reflects a complex understanding of temporality. The enslaved people who created these boxes were aware that their lives and possessions were under constant threat. By concealing objects in a deliberate and systematic way, they were attempting to preserve a sense of permanence, a continuity that could survive beyond immediate circumstance. These boxes may have been intended to be retrieved later, perhaps by family members or community members, or to remain as a protective or spiritual measure for the long term. In this sense, the act of burial was both practical and symbolic, bridging the present and the future, providing a connection across generations, and safeguarding memories and identities in a society structured to erase them. The spatial consistency of where these boxes were placed offers further insight into the daily lives and priorities of enslaved people. Floors, corners, and pits were chosen not only because they provided concealment, but also because they were intimately connected to the domestic spaces the enslaved people inhabited. These were areas that they occupied daily, understood thoroughly, and could manipulate with knowledge that overseers or property owners often lacked. This intimate familiarity with the space reflects not only practical knowledge, but also a subtle form of resistance. By mastering the very structures that were meant to confine and control them, enslaved people were able to create private realms of meaning, identity, and agency. The buried boxes thus become a form of silent testimony, evidence of ingenuity, resilience, and the capacity to assert control within an oppressive system. Further evidence of intentionality can be seen in the uniformity of placement across multiple sites. The fact that similar hiding strategies were employed in different quarters, plantations, and neighborhoods suggests the existence of shared knowledge or cultural norms guiding these practices. This was not a random occurrence. It was part of a larger, possibly communal system of safeguarding objects that had meaning, whether personal, spiritual, or symbolic. Oral histories and accounts, passed down through generations, hint at similar practices being taught and observed within enslaved communities, reinforcing the notion that the deliberate burial of these boxes was a widespread, culturally embedded practice. The objects themselves also reinforce the notion of deliberate concealment. They were not chosen at random. Every item had purpose, significance, or symbolic weight. Protective charms, coins, trinkets, buttons, and pieces of jewelry were carefully placed, sometimes wrapped or arranged to maintain integrity and meaning. The precision with which these objects were hidden underlines the seriousness of the act and the awareness that these boxes represented more than mere possessions. They were vessels of memory, identity and hope. The meticulous care in both selection and concealment reflects an understanding of permanence and an anticipation of the future, a quiet but deliberate defiance against a system that sought to deny them both. Moreover, the very act of hiding these boxes illustrates the duality of visibility and invisibility in the lives of enslaved people. These objects were meant to exist, to endure, yet remain hidden from the immediate gaze of those in power. This duality mirrors the broader strategies of survival employed by enslaved communities, maintaining identity, culture and autonomy in ways that were largely invisible to the overseers and owners. The buried boxes in this sense were not only practical but also symbolic acts of resistance, asserting the right to create, preserve and protect meaning in a world designed to erase it. The intentional burial of boxes under slave quarters in New Orleans then is a window into the strategic thinking, cultural knowledge and resilience of enslaved people. Every aspect of the practice, the selection of objects, the careful crafting of containers, the precise placement beneath floors and in hidden corners, speaks to a profound awareness of space, time and consequence. The uniformity and care in these actions highlight that the act of burial was not merely about hiding possessions, it was about asserting agency, preserving cultural memory, and creating continuity in the face of systemic oppression. These boxes are therefore more than historical artifacts, they are
As the discovery of buried boxes beneath slave quarters in New Orleans continued, archaeologists and historians found themselves increasingly baffled by the consistency of the contents. With each new excavation, the same types of items emerged: small personal objects, charms, trinkets, coins, and ritualistic items, meticulously preserved and carefully concealed. What made these discoveries particularly confounding was not only the repetition of contents across different sites, but also the deliberate manner in which the objects were chosen and hidden. The uniformity suggested a shared practice or cultural understanding among the enslaved communities, but the reasons behind it remained elusive. Researchers struggled to fully comprehend why so many people across different locations and periods adhered to what appeared to be a common set of objects, each imbued with personal, spiritual, or symbolic significance. The bewilderment was compounded by the sheer thoughtfulness and precision evident in the construction of the boxes themselves. Archaeologists noted that many were not merely crude containers but carefully crafted vessels, designed to endure the ravages of time, moisture, and decay. Wood was often selected and treated to resist rot, cloth or natural fibers were used to wrap delicate items, metal fastenings and sealants were applied to secure the contents. The craftsmanship suggested skill, planning, and a deep understanding of preservation. For the researchers uncovering these boxes, the question arose: how had enslaved individuals who lived under constant surveillance and deprivation developed such sophisticated methods for creating durable, long-lasting repository? The repeated use of these techniques across multiple sites only deepened the mystery, hinting at shared knowledge or oral traditions that dictated not only what should be included, but how it should be protected. Even more perplexing was the emotional and symbolic weight carried by the content. Many of the items appeared at first glance to be ordinary or insignificant: beads, coins, small pieces of jewelry, buttons, or trinkets, but a closer examination revealed that these objects were anything but trivial. Coins, for example, may have represented the accumulation of small personal wealth, a rare form of autonomy in a society designed to strip enslaved people of property and agency. Beads and trinkets often carried familial or cultural significance, reminding individuals of kinship, heritage, and traditions that had been forcibly uprooted during the transatlantic slave trade. Charms and talismans, carefully wrapped or arranged, were likely intended to provide spiritual protection, ward off harm, or maintain a connection with ancestral beliefs. The consistent presence of such items in every box underscored the idea that these were not random collections, but intentional selections, each object carefully chosen for its utility, meaning, or protective properties. The placement of these boxes added another layer of complexity to the puzzle. Each was buried in hidden or obscure locations within or beneath the slave quarters, often under floorboards, near corners, or beneath hearths. These areas were chosen not by accident, but because they offered both concealment and accessibility. The meticulous placement reflected a nuanced understanding of space. The enslaved individuals knew which areas would be disturbed and which would remain relatively untouched. Some boxes were further camouflaged beneath layers of debris, ashes, or other objects to prevent accidental discovery. The consistency of this approach across multiple sites indicated a shared understanding of the importance of secrecy and protection. Researchers were left questioning how such knowledge was transmitted. Was it taught from one generation to the next, shared orally among members of the community, or passed along through observation and practice? The answer likely lies in a combination of these methods, revealing a rich, albeit hidden cultural continuity. Historians also considered the psychological and social dimensions of these repeated practices. The act of carefully selecting, crafting, and burying these boxes under oppressive conditions was itself a form of agency. In a world designed to strip enslaved people of autonomy, identity, and control over their environment, these boxes represented a small but significant reclamation of power. The deliberate repetition of contents across different boxes may have reinforced a sense of order, community, and shared understanding, providing psychological stability and continuity in a life dominated by uncertainty and violence. By adhering to a consistent pattern, enslaved individuals could assert that their lives, beliefs, and cultural practices mattered, even if society at large sought to deny their humanity. Another puzzling aspect for researchers was the universality of the objects contained in these boxes, regardless of the specific location or plantation. Whether the boxes were found in urban dwellings, rural plantations, or isolated quarters, the contents remained remarkably similar. This suggested that the practice transcended individual households and reflected broader cultural or communal knowledge. The uniformity also raised questions about communication and shared experience among enslaved populations. How did these practices spread, and why were they so widely adopted? Oral histories, ethnographic studies, and comparative analysis with African and Afro-Caribbean traditions provided clues, suggesting that these hidden boxes were part of a larger, transatlantic system of belief and practice adapted to the conditions of enslavement in New Orleans. They served as repositories of both personal and collective identity, connecting generations through objects imbued with meaning, protection, and memory. The repeated pattern of discovery had a profound impact on the academic community. Scholars began to realize that these boxes were more than mere curiosities or isolated artifacts. They were vital keys to understanding the lived experiences of enslaved people. Traditional historical records, often written by slaveholders or observers, rarely captured the intimate, everyday practices of those living in bondage. The boxes, by contrast, offered a rare, tangible window into private lives, spiritual practices, and strategies for survival. Each discovery forced historians to reconsider assumptions about agency, resistance, and the transmission of cultural knowledge under slavery. The uniformity of the contents revealed that enslaved individuals were not passive participants in their own history. They were active agents, finding ways to preserve memory, assert identity, and maintain a sense of control over their own lives. In addition, the repeated discovery of similar items prompted questions about the symbolic functions of these objects. Were they intended primarily for personal use, spiritual protection, or future retrieval by family members? Did they serve as offerings, talismans, or messages for descendants? The consistency of contents suggested that multiple purposes may have been intended simultaneously. Each box could function as a physical repository of memory, a spiritual safeguard, and a form of cultural resistance. The fact that so many boxes contained the same types of items indicates that enslaved people shared not only techniques, but also beliefs and values, ensuring continuity and coherence in a society designed to obliterate both. Finally, the bafflement of researchers over the consistency of these contents underscores the profound sophistication of the practice. The repeated selection of certain objects, their careful preservation, and their deliberate concealment reflect deep cultural knowledge, foresight, and an acute understanding of human and environmental behavior. The boxes were more than functional containers. They were embodiments of resilience, identity, and hope. The fact that archaeologists and historians continue to be confounded by the uniformity of these finds speaks to the complexity of enslaved communities' cultural practice, their ability to adapt and survive, and the enduring mystery of lives lived under extreme oppression yet marked by ingenuity, intentionality, and unyielding humanity. Among the most intriguing aspects of the buried boxes discovered beneath the slave quarters of New Orleans was the remarkable consistency in the types of items they contained. Scholars and archaeologists quickly realized that many of these boxes included personal belongings, charms, and symbolic objects, suggesting a deliberate choice of contents with both practical and spiritual significance. These objects were not haphazardly gathered or randomly selected. Rather, they reflected the priorities, beliefs, and daily realities of the enslaved individuals who placed them there. Each box seemed to serve as a microcosm of a person's world, encompassing elements of identity, protection, memory, and hope, and the repeated appearance of similar objects across different sites suggested a shared cultural understanding that transcended individual household. Personal belongings were among the most commonly found items in the boxes. Coins, buttons, beads, and small pieces of jewelry often appeared, carefully wrapped or arranged to prevent damage. These items carried multiple layers of meaning. Coins, for instance, were more than mere currency.
They represented autonomy, the ability to accumulate personal value, and a tangible connection to the possibility of self-determination. Buttons and beads were not merely decorative, they could signify personal style, social belonging, or familial ties, and in some cases they may have been salvaged from clothing of special importance or symbolic meaning. Jewelry fragments could be reminders of family members, gifts, or cherished possessions salvaged from a world that offered very few opportunities to own property. The consistent inclusion of such items in every box underscores the importance of material culture as a way for enslaved individuals to assert identity and maintain a sense of self under conditions that were designed to erase both. In addition to personal belongings, many boxes contain charms and ritual objects, often crafted from natural materials, metals, or beads. These objects suggest a deliberate effort to engage with spiritual or protective. Charms could serve as amulets to ward off harm, curses, or misfortune, reflecting belief systems that had been carried across the Atlantic from Africa and adapted to life in New Orleans. Some items may have been intended to safeguard the living, while others may have served as protective talismans for the deceased or as conduits for ancestral guidance. The careful preservation and repeated inclusion of these objects in each box point to their deep significance. They were more than decorative trinkets. They were embodiments of cultural knowledge, spiritual resilience, and psychological fortitude in the face of oppression. Symbolic objects often complemented the personal and spiritual items in the boxes. Small figurines, carved pieces of wood, and objects fashioned from stone or bone were sometimes found alongside the charms and coin. These items could represent protective spirits, ancestors, or symbolic gestures toward family or community. In many African diasporic traditions, such objects serve as physical links to the unseen world, providing protection, guidance, or a sense of continuity between generations. The consistency with which these symbolic objects appear across boxes suggests that they were a shared component of a broader cultural practice, a material expression of belief systems that were transmitted orally or through demonstration rather than through written instruction. In this way, the boxes were both repositories of physical objects and vessels of intangible knowledge, carrying forward traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The intentional inclusion of these objects also speaks to the social and communal aspects of enslaved life. While the boxes were often hidden beneath individual living spaces, the practice of creating them appears to have been widely known and culturally reinforced. This implies that enslaved individuals did not merely act in isolation, they participated in networks of knowledge and practice that were passed down and shared among community members. Whether taught by elders, observed from neighbors, or transmitted through oral tradition, the repeated selection of certain types of objects indicates a collective understanding of what was valuable, meaningful, or protected. Each box thus reflects not only individual priorities but also a communal framework for maintaining cultural continuity and spiritual safety. The craftsmanship of the boxes themselves further underscores the intentionality of these buried objects. Containers were carefully constructed from available materials such as wood, metal, and cloth, often sealed and reinforced to protect their contents from environmental damage. The skill involved in creating these containers suggests knowledge of carpentry, preservation techniques, and spatial planning which would have been necessary to ensure that the objects remained intact over time. The boxes were designed to endure, hidden under floors, buried in pits, or tucked into corners, and their repeated survival across centuries is a testament to both their construction and the foresight of those who created them. The meticulous preparation of these boxes mirrors the care with which their contents were selected, demonstrating that each aspect of the practice was deliberate and purposeful. Another aspect of interest is the psychological dimension of these objects. For enslaved individuals, the creation of a hidden repository of belongings and charms was a form of asserting control in an environment where autonomy was severely restricted. The act of selecting objects with specific meanings, carefully arranging them and burying them in hidden locations allowed individuals to create a private realm of significance within spaces that were otherwise dominated by oppression. In a society designed to strip people of their agency, these boxes were a subtle but powerful assertion of control, offering a measure of security, identity, and continuity in the face of systemic violence and uncertainty. The repeated presence of charms, personal effects, and symbolic objects also suggests a dual function, practical and spiritual. Many of the items likely served protective purposes, guarding the living or offering spiritual security, while simultaneously preserving tangible connections to family, heritage, and identity. This duality reflects the complexity of enslaved life, in which survival required both material ingenuity and spiritual resilience. Each box can thus be understood as a multifaceted tool addressing immediate practical needs while also maintaining links to memory, culture, and belief systems that could not be eradicated, even under the harshest conditions. Moreover, the fact that similar types of items are found in boxes across multiple locations suggests a standardized approach, a culturally reinforced understanding of what should be included in these hidden repositories. This uniformity points to the existence of shared knowledge and values among enslaved populations in New Orleans. It implies that the creation of these boxes was not merely personal but part of a wider communal practice, with each box reflecting both individual choices and collective cultural wisdom. The objects themselves, repeated across sites, become a tangible record of practices, beliefs and priorities that would otherwise have been invisible in historical records dominated by the perspectives of enslavers. The discovery of these boxes and their consistent contents challenges traditional narratives about the lives of enslaved people, emphasizing agency, resilience and the importance of material and spiritual culture. Each box, carefully filled with personal belongings, charms and symbolic objects, serves as evidence that enslaved individuals actively sought to maintain control over aspects of their lives, to preserve cultural identity and to create continuity across generations. The repeated presence of these objects across sites underscores the sophistication of the practice, the depth of cultural memory, and the enduring human need for protection, identity, and hope in the face of oppression. The discoveries of buried boxes beneath slave quarters in New Orleans were not limited to a single site or plantation. Over time, archaeologists, historians, and even local residents began to notice a striking pattern. These boxes appeared across multiple locations spanning urban dwellings, rural plantations, and isolated cabins. Each new excavation revealed a similar type of hidden container placed deliberately beneath floors in corners or near hearths, and filled with the same types of personal belongings, charms, and symbolic objects. The recurrence of these finds across such diverse sites was remarkable, suggesting that the practice was widespread and culturally embedded among enslaved populations rather than being an isolated or idiosyncratic habit of a few individuals. The geographic and social breadth of these discoveries illuminated a larger network of knowledge, practice, and tradition that transcended individual households, neighborhoods, and generations. Researchers were particularly struck by the consistency of the contents across these widely separated locations. Coins, beads, buttons, small pieces of jewelry, charms, and other symbolic items appeared again and again, regardless of the specific site, the size of the dwelling, or the socio-economic status of the enslaved people who lived there. This uniformity indicated a shared understanding of what was important to preserve, protect, or spiritually safeguard. It also raised intriguing questions about the transmission of knowledge. How had this practice spread, and what mechanisms allowed enslaved individuals in different parts of New Orleans to adhere to similar patterns of selection, concealment, and burial? Scholars began to consider oral traditions, communal teaching, and shared cultural heritage as key factors, suggesting that these boxes were part of a broader system of maintaining cultural continuity under conditions of extreme oppression. The spatial distribution of these boxes highlighted not only the widespread nature of the practice, but also the intimate knowledge enslaved people had of their environments. Urban dwellings, with their tight quarters and high density of human activity, required creative concealment strategy. Boxes might be hidden beneath floorboards, tucked into corners, or concealed under debris in areas that were rarely disturbed. In rural plantations where living spaces were larger and more dispersed, boxes were sometimes buried in small pits near foundations or hearths, taking advantage of natural or structural concealment. Across all sites, the careful placement reflected a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Enslaved people knew which areas were less likely to be inspected and could anticipate potential threats to the safety of their hidden possessions. This strategic approach underscores the intentionality and foresight involved in the practice, as well as the resilience and ingenuity required to preserve cultural and personal artifacts under constant surveillance. The repeated discovery of boxes across multiple sites also emphasizes the communal and cultural dimensions of the practice. While each box was hidden within an individual's living space, the similarities in contents and methods suggest a shared understanding among enslaved communities about what should be preserved, how it should be protected, and why. This implies that knowledge was transmitted through observation, oral instruction, or communal teaching, reinforcing a sense of collective identity even within the isolating conditions of slavery. The boxes, therefore, were both personal and communal. Personal in that they contained meaningful objects for an individual or family, and communal in that they reflected a shared system of values, beliefs, and cultural practice. Another important aspect revealed by the distribution of these boxes is the role of spatial and environmental awareness in their concealment. Enslaved individuals demonstrated an acute understanding of the structures they inhabited and the patterns of movement around. They knew which areas were least likely to be disturbed by overseers, visitors, or other residents, and they used this knowledge to maximize the security of their hidden belongings. The choice of floorboards, corners, hearths, or pits was never random. It was informed by experience and observation. In urban settings, this meant identifying discrete areas in small, crowded quarters, while in rural plantations it involved exploiting the larger, less monitored spaces. Across all sites, the successful concealment of boxes for decades or even centuries demonstrates the effectiveness of these strategies and the careful planning involved. The presence of similar boxes across multiple sites also provides insight into the spiritual and symbolic significance of the practice. Many of the items found in these boxes, charms, amulets, symbolic objects, and ritualistic trinkets, point to a cultural continuity that transcended individual households. The recurrence of these objects across widely separated sites suggests that enslaved people were collectively maintaining spiritual traditions, adapting ancestral knowledge to their new environment, and finding ways to protect themselves and their community. This widespread practice highlights the resilience of cultural memory, showing how enslaved populations preserved connections to heritage, belief systems, and communal identity despite forced displacement, oppression, and systematic attempts to erase their cultural practice. The uniformity in both placement and contents across multiple sites also challenges traditional assumptions about the lives of enslaved people. For decades, historical records largely focused on economic production, property ownership, and the perspective of enslavers, often neglecting the intimate practices and strategies of resistance employed by enslaved communities. The repeated discovery of buried boxes across New Orleans forces a re-evaluation. These were not passive individuals living only at the mercy of their oppressors. They were active agents, creating meaningful spaces, preserving valuable objects, and maintaining cultural and spiritual continuity in conditions designed to strip them of both. The widespread presence of these boxes across multiple locations reinforces the idea that enslaved people exercised creativity, strategy, and cultural preservation even under extreme duress. Furthermore, the distribution of these boxes across the city demonstrates the adaptability of the practice. Urban and rural conditions presented very different challenges, yet the core principles, selection of meaningful objects, careful concealment, and long-term preservation remained consistent. This adaptability reflects the ingenuity of enslaved communities who were able to translate shared cultural practices into diverse environments, ensuring the survival of both physical objects and intangible knowledge. The practice of burying boxes was therefore dynamic, capable of adjusting to local conditions, while maintaining a consistent symbolic and practical framework. The repeated discoveries across multiple sites also shed light on the interconnectedness of enslaved communities in New Orleans. Even though families and individuals were often separated, relocated, or sold to different plantations, the consistency in the boxes suggests a network of shared understanding, teaching, and cultural reinforcement. This points to a resilient social structure in which knowledge, belief systems, and practices were maintained collectively, reinforcing community cohesion and cultural identity despite the fragmentation imposed by slavery. The boxes thus serve as tangible evidence of this resilience, and the ways enslaved people navigated the constraints imposed upon them, while preserving the essential elements of their cultural and spiritual life. Finally, the fact that archaeologists continue to uncover these boxes across multiple sites decades and even centuries later demonstrates the enduring power and effectiveness of the practice. Each new discovery provides further confirmation that this was a deliberate, widespread, and culturally significant activity, reflecting shared values, spiritual beliefs, and survival strategy. By examining the repeated pattern of hidden boxes, researchers gain not only material artifacts but also insights into the social networks, cultural continuity, and resilient agency of enslaved people. The widespread occurrence of these hidden boxes across New Orleans offers a compelling testimony to the ingenuity, intentionality, and shared cultural knowledge that characterized the lives.
Part of a home but a sacred center representing life, warmth, sustenance, and protection. Burying a box beneath or near the hearth may have been intended to safeguard the household, to protect the family members who lived there, or to ensure continuity and well-being for future generations. Similarly, corners and thresholds are often understood in spiritual traditions as liminal spaces where protection and influence can be maximized, making them ideal locations for the concealment of spiritually charged objects. These choices reveal that enslaved individuals were actively engaging with spiritual frameworks, adapting ancestral knowledge to their lived environment, and using hidden objects as a form of both ritual practice and protective strategy. The presence of protective items in the boxes also speaks to the profound challenges and dangers enslaved people faced in New Orleans. The constant threat of physical violence, separation from family, forced labor, and systemic oppression created an environment of extreme uncertainty and vulnerability. In such a context, spiritual practices and protective rituals were not merely cultural expressions. They were practical tools for navigating daily life. Charms and amulets served to mitigate perceived dangers, to create a sense of security, and to assert some measure of control over circumstances that were largely beyond individual influence. The repeated inclusion of these items in every box underscores the importance of spiritual agency as a means of survival and psychological resilience, offering insight into the ways enslaved people sought to protect themselves, their families, and their community. Scholars have also noted the cultural continuity reflected in these protective objects. Despite being forcibly displaced from Africa and subjected to generations of oppression, enslaved communities in New Orleans retained and adapted key elements of their ancestral spiritual tradition. Many of the charms and ritual objects show clear connections to West and Central African religious practices, as well as elements of Afro-Caribbean syncretism that blended African belief systems with influences from European and indigenous spiritual framework. This continuity illustrates not only the resilience of cultural memory, but also the creativity of enslaved people in finding ways to preserve identity, maintain connection with ancestors, and safeguard their communities in a radically transformed and hostile environment. The recurring presence of these items in boxes across multiple sites serves as tangible evidence of the persistence and adaptation of spiritual practice under slavery. The protective objects also reveal an intimate understanding of the interplay between the physical and spiritual world. Enslaved people recognized that their survival depended not only on physical skill and resilience, but also on engaging with unseen forces that could influence fortune, health, and safety. Charms and talismans were therefore carefully chosen, often imbued with symbolic meaning, and positioned with thought to their spatial and energetic significance. The consistency with which these objects appear in multiple boxes suggests that knowledge of their use and placement was widely shared and transmitted, forming a kind of unwritten guide to spiritual protection that informed daily life and household practice. Each box becomes a microcosm of this belief system, a carefully curated set of objects designed to interact with both material and spiritual realms in order to preserve the lives and well-being of those who placed them there. The repeated presence of protective items in every box also emphasizes the communal nature of spiritual practice among enslaved populations. Although each box may have been hidden within a private dwelling, the adherence to similar objects and placement strategies indicates that the practices were part of a shared cultural framework. Knowledge was likely passed down from elders, taught within families, and reinforced by observation of neighbors and peers. This shared understanding created a network of spiritual and protective practices that extended across households and plantations, strengthening bonds between community members and reinforcing cultural cohesion despite the constant threat of displacement, separation, and violence. The boxes therefore were both individual and communal. They safeguarded personal and household well-being while reflecting a broader culturally embedded system of belief and protection. The protective items also provide a window into the psychological dimensions of enslaved life. The act of burying these objects demonstrates foresight, planning, and a sense of agency in circumstances where choices were extremely limited. By creating and concealing these boxes, enslaved individuals were asserting control over aspects of their lives that could be influenced, creating a private realm of security and meaning amidst pervasive uncertainty. The repeated appearance of similar protective items underscores that this was not a one-time act, but a sustained practice, reflecting the ongoing importance of spiritual safeguarding, communal continuity, and psychological resilience in everyday life. The consistency of spiritual and protective items across multiple boxes also challenges conventional assumptions about the lives of enslaved people. Historical narratives often focus on the economic, physical, or labor dimensions of slavery, leaving little room to appreciate the richness and sophistication of spiritual life under oppression. The repeated discovery of charms, amulets, and symbolic objects highlights that enslaved people maintained vibrant spiritual traditions, developed strategies for protection and survival, and cultivated resilience through both material and immaterial means. These boxes, with their carefully curated contents, are physical evidence of the depth, intentionality, and ingenuity of these practices, revealing a dimension of enslaved life that traditional records often obscure. Finally, the presence of protective and spiritual objects in every box underscores the enduring importance of cultural memory and continuity. Despite centuries of oppression, displacement, and systemic attempts to erase identity, enslaved populations in New Orleans maintained practices that connected them to their ancestors, safeguarded their communities, and preserved their sense of self. The repeated appearance of these items across multiple sites demonstrates that these were not isolated or random acts but a deeply embedded cultural practice. Each box serves as a testament to the resilience, creativity, and spiritual depth of enslaved communities, offering modern researchers a rare and profound insight into the ways people endured, resisted, and preserved meaning under the most challenging of circumstances. The hidden boxes discovered beneath the slave quarters of New Orleans reveal a fascinating pattern. They were not randomly buried, nor were their contents left to chance. The repeated appearance of certain objects, personal belongings, charms, symbolic items, suggests that the creators of these boxes followed a deliberate and consistent approach, demonstrating remarkable foresight and intentionality. Every box discovered in multiple locations contained similar objects, carefully selected and placed to serve specific purposes, whether personal, spiritual, or symbolic. This consistency across sites has puzzled researchers for decades, prompting questions about the shared cultural practices, belief systems, and survival strategies of the enslaved people who lived in these spaces. The uniformity of contents indicates that enslaved individuals were not acting in isolation, rather they were participating in a shared cultural framework. These objects, coins, beads, buttons, charms, small trinkets, and symbolic artifacts, were repeatedly chosen for their perceived value, significance, or protective power. Coins, for example, may have served as a rare form of personal wealth, offering a sense of autonomy or a means to plan for the future in a society that systematically denied them property and financial independence. Beads and buttons may have represented cultural identity, familial ties, or personal expression, serving as tangible connections to memories of home, family, or tradition. Charms and ritual objects, meanwhile, provided protection against harm, illness, or spiritual misfortune, reflecting deeply rooted belief systems inherited from African traditions and adapted to the context of slavery in New Orleans. The act of placing these items in boxes was itself highly intentional. Archaeologists have found boxes buried beneath floorboards, near hearths, in corners, and sometimes in small pits, often in locations that required knowledge of the environment and its vulnerability. Such placement was strategic. It minimized the risk of discovery by overseers, neighbors, or passers-by, while still allowing for potential retrieval. In many cases, the boxes were further protected by wrapping objects in cloth or organic materials, sealing containers with nails, pitch, or other methods, and camouflaging them beneath layers of debris or flooring. The careful planning evident in the construction and concealment of the boxes demonstrates both practical skill and an understanding of long-term preservation, suggesting that these acts were meant to endure, possibly for years or even generations. The repetition of these contents across multiple sites underscores the communal nature of the practice. Even though each box may have been buried in a private dwelling or for the benefit of a single family, the similarities between boxes suggest the transmission of knowledge and cultural norms among enslaved populations. Oral traditions, community instruction, and observation likely played critical roles in guiding the selection of objects and methods of concealment. This shared knowledge reflects a continuity of culture, a system of values and practices that transcended individual households and geographic boundaries. The boxes were, in this sense, both deeply personal and intrinsically communal, serving as repositories of memory, protection, and identity within a broader cultural framework. The spiritual significance of the objects cannot be overstated. Many items, including charms and ritual trinkets, were believed to offer protection against physical or spiritual dangers. Enslaved individuals faced daily threats, physical violence, forced labor, family separation, and systemic oppression. In such an environment, spiritual practices were not merely symbolic. They were essential tools for psychological resilience and survival. Protective objects served to create a sense of safety, to maintain spiritual balance, and to assert agency in circumstances where autonomy was severely restricted. The repeated appearance of similar protective items in every box highlights their importance as part of a culturally shared approach to safeguarding both self and family, illustrating the sophisticated understanding enslaved people had of spiritual and material interconnection. Furthermore, the consistency in the contents suggests an adherence to unwritten rules or guidelines regarding what was valuable and meaningful enough to include. While each individual or family may have contributed personal touches, the repetition of certain objects points to standardized practices, perhaps taught and reinforced over time within communities. This standardization also indicates that the boxes functioned not only as practical storage or protective caches, but also as culturally significant repositories that embodied shared values, beliefs, and priorities. They were tools for preserving identity and memory in a world designed to erase individuality, serving both pragmatic and symbolic purposes simultaneously. The physical craftsmanship of the boxes further emphasizes the intentionality behind these practices. Many containers were made from durable materials, carefully assembled to withstand burial, environmental hazards, and the passage of time. Cloth, wood, metal, and natural fibers were used thoughtfully to protect the items, and the effort required to construct these boxes, gather appropriate objects, and conceal them safely indicates planning, skill, and dedication. This level of intentionality suggests that the act of creating and burying the boxes was more than a simple exercise in hiding valuables. It was a deliberate,
culturally informed practice designed to protect, preserve, and transmit personal and communal significance. The uniformity of contents and placement across multiple sites also reflects adaptability within a shared cultural framework. Enslaved individuals faced varying environmental and social conditions depending on whether they lived in urban dwellings or rural plantations, yet the core elements of the practice remained consistent. They adapted to their immediate surroundings, choosing floorboards, corners, hearths, or pits, based on what offered the greatest protection, while maintaining the essential cultural and spiritual significance of the items included. This adaptability demonstrates the ingenuity and resilience of enslaved communities, capable of translating shared knowledge into diverse contexts without compromising the meaning or purpose of their action. The repeated appearance of these boxes also challenges traditional historical narratives about enslaved people, which often focus on labor, economic production, or oppression, while neglecting the richness of cultural life and spiritual practice. These hidden boxes reveal that enslaved people maintained sophisticated systems of belief, identity preservation, and material culture, often in ways invisible to those in power. By analyzing the consistency of contents, researchers gain insight into how enslaved communities navigated the demands of survival, cultural continuity, and spiritual resilience. The boxes are therefore not merely artifacts but evidence of agency, ingenuity, and deeply embedded cultural knowledge that allowed enslaved individuals to assert control over aspects of their lives despite systemic attempts to deny them autonomy. Finally, the repeated pattern of objects in these boxes, across New Orleans, emphasizes the importance of continuity and intergenerational knowledge. The similarities suggest that these practices were taught, shared, and reinforced over time, ensuring that even under the conditions of slavery, cultural, spiritual, and protective knowledge could endure. Each box becomes a tangible link in a chain of tradition, a carefully curated combination of objects designed to safeguard memory, identity, and community. The consistency of these contents underscores the resilience of enslaved people and their ability to create enduring structures of meaning, protection, and cultural preservation in a society determined to erase both. One of the most striking aspects of the buried boxes discovered beneath slave quarters in New Orleans is the uniformity of the objects contained within them despite being spread across different locations, plantations, and urban dwellings. Each box consistently included items that held personal, symbolic, and spiritual significance, revealing a carefully maintained cultural practice that transcended individual households. Archaeologists and historians have noted that these items, coins, beads, buttons, small pieces of jewelry, charms, and ritual objects were deliberately chosen, carefully preserved, and meticulously buried. The repetition of these objects across multiple sites suggests a shared understanding among enslaved people about what was valuable, meaningful, and necessary for both practical survival and spiritual protection. The personal objects within the boxes, coins, jewelry, beads, and buttons, offer insight into the daily lives, priorities, and identities of enslaved individuals. Coins were more than a form of currency. They represented agency, the ability to accumulate personal value, and the hope of future autonomy, however limited. Beads and buttons could signify cultural expression, familial ties, or personal style, serving as tangible links to memories of home, family, and ancestral traditions. Jewelry fragments were often cherished possessions, salvaged or passed down, carrying both sentimental and symbolic weight. The repetition of such personal items in boxes across multiple sites highlights the importance of material culture as a means of preserving identity and asserting humanity under oppressive conditions, designed to strip enslaved people of both. Beyond personal objects, many boxes contained charms, amulets, and ritualistic items, intended to provide protection or spiritual guide. These objects were crafted from natural materials, metal, beads, or cloth, reflecting African, Afro-Caribbean, and Creole traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and been adapted to life in New Orleans. Charms might protect individuals or households from harm, ward off malevolent forces, or act as conduits for ancestral guidance. The careful placement and preservation of these items, often wrapped or secured within the boxes, indicate that enslaved individuals understood the spiritual importance of both the objects themselves and the manner in which they were hidden. The recurrence of these protective items in boxes across multiple sites demonstrates the shared cultural knowledge and spiritual practices, and endured despite forced displacement and the systematic erasure of African tradition. The spatial placement of the boxes further underscores the intentionality of the practice. Boxes were often buried under floorboards, in corners near hearths, or within small pits, locations chosen both for concealment and spiritual significance. Floors and corners offered discretion, reducing the likelihood of discovery by overseers or neighbors, while hearths were culturally and spiritually meaningful, often regarded as the heart of the household or a sacred center. The deliberate selection of burial locations reveals a sophisticated understanding of environment and spatial dynamics, demonstrating both practical skill and an engagement with cultural and spiritual framework. This careful placement was consistently observed across multiple sites, suggesting a standardized approach to the concealment and safeguarding of valuable and meaningful items. The repeated patterns in both content and placement reflect the communal transmission of knowledge and practice. Although each box may have been created and buried for an individual or family, the similarities across sites indicate that enslaved people shared cultural guidelines for what should be included and how it should be hidden. Oral tradition, communal instruction and observation likely played central roles in passing down this knowledge. This system of shared understanding allowed cultural practices, spiritual beliefs, and protective strategies to persist across generations and geographic boundaries, ensuring continuity even under oppressive conditions. The boxes were therefore simultaneously personal and communal, serving as repositories of individual identity and collective cultural memory. The protective and spiritual objects within the boxes also illustrate the psychological strategies enslaved people employed to cope with their environment. The threats they faced were constant and varied: physical violence, family separation, harsh labor, and the systemic denial of agency. Spiritual and protective practices offered a means of asserting control in a world designed to deny it. Charms and amulets provided reassurance, a sense of agency, and an avenue for maintaining connections to ancestry and belief system. The consistent inclusion of such items demonstrates the significance of spiritual and symbolic acts in preserving well-being, both physically and psychologically, and highlights the intricate ways enslaved communities navigated the challenges of daily life while maintaining cultural continuity. The durability and craftsmanship of the boxes themselves further emphasize intentionality and foresight. Containers were often constructed from durable materials, such as wood, metal, and cloth, sometimes reinforced to withstand burial and environmental damage. Objects inside were carefully wrapped or cushioned to preserve their integrity. This level of craftsmanship required skill, patience, and planning, reflecting the importance of both the objects and their preservation. The recurrence of these techniques across multiple boxes suggests that knowledge of construction and preservation was widely shared, forming part of the broader cultural practice surrounding the creation and burial of these repositories. The repeated contents and placement across different locations also reveal adaptability within a shared framework. Urban dwellings presented challenges such as smaller spaces and higher surveillance, requiring precise concealment techniques under floorboards or within tight corners. Rural plantations, with larger areas and dispersed living quarters, required different strategies, such as burying boxes in pits or under hearths. Despite these environmental variations, the core principles of object selection, spiritual significance, and concealment remained consistent. This adaptability underscores the ingenuity of enslaved communities, demonstrating their ability to maintain cultural and spiritual practices in diverse and often hostile environments. Furthermore, the recurrence of similar items across multiple boxes highlights the resilience of cultural memory. Despite centuries of displacement, oppression, and forced labor, enslaved communities preserved traditions, spiritual practices, and personal symbolism through these hidden repositories. The boxes were a form of material culture that allowed enslaved individuals to maintain links to family, ancestry, and community, serving as tangible expressions of identity and continuity. They were also a subtle form of resistance, asserting presence, value, and agency in a society determined to deny them both. The consistent appearance of these objects across sites emphasizes that this was not isolated or occasional practice, but a deliberate, culturally reinforced and widely shared system. The presence of ritualistic and protective items in every box also reflects the deep intertwining of spiritual and practical concerns. While coins, jewelry, and personal objects served practical purposes, charms and symbolic items addressed spiritual and psychological needs. These dual functions underscore the complexity of enslaved life, in which survival depended not only on physical labor and resourcefulness, but also on spiritual engagement and cultural continuity. Each box was a carefully curated microcosm of both material and immaterial values, encompassing protection, identity, and memory. The repeated inclusion of similar items across multiple boxes demonstrates that enslaved individuals consistently recognized the importance of balancing practical and spiritual needs in their daily life. Finally, the repeated appearance of these objects challenges traditional historical narratives that often overlook the richness of enslaved life beyond labor and oppression. The uniformity of the contents across sites provides tangible evidence of agency, Cultural continuity and spiritual practice. These boxes serve as a window into the daily lives, beliefs, and strategies of enslaved people, offering insight into how they preserved identity, maintained cultural memory, and navigated both practical and spiritual challenge. The consistency of objects, across multiple sites, underscores that these were not isolated acts of survival, but a widespread.
The final key observation regarding the buried boxes beneath slave quarters in New Orleans centers on the astonishing uniformity and deliberate repetition of their contents across multiple sites, revealing a cultural and spiritual practice that was both widespread and highly intentional. Archaeologists and historians have consistently noted that, despite differences in location, urban or rural settings and individual households, the boxes invariably contain similar objects: coins, beads, buttons, small pieces of jewelry, charms, and other symbolic items. The recurrence of these items points to a shared understanding of what was valuable, protective, and meaningful, underscoring the sophisticated and deliberate nature of the practice. These were not incidental collections. They were carefully curated repositories designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously, encompassing material, spiritual, and symbolic purposes. The personal objects found in the boxes, coins, jewelry fragments, buttons, and beads, provide insight into the lived experiences, priorities, and identities of enslaved individuals. Coins represented a rare form of agency, a means to exert some control over resources in a system that denied ownership and autonomy. Beads and buttons served as markers of cultural identity, familial ties, and personal expressance, often reminding their owners of kinship networks, ancestral roots, or significant life events. Jewelry fragments were tangible connections to memory, heritage, and personal significance, salvaged or preserved with deliberate care. The repetition of such personal objects across multiple boxes underscores the importance of material culture as a method for asserting identity and maintaining continuity in a society designed to erase individuality and human dignity. Equally compelling are the protective and ritual objects consistently found in these boxes. Charms, amulets, and symbolic artifacts were deliberately selected for their perceived spiritual efficacy, offering protection against harm, illness, or misfortune. Crafted from materials such as metal, bone, wood, and beads, these items reflect African and Afro-Caribbean spiritual traditions that survived forced migration and were adapted to the context of enslavement in New Orleans. The careful wrapping, placement, and burial of these objects reveal an understanding of spiritual significance that extended beyond mere superstition. These items were central to maintaining a sense of security, continuity, and connection to ancestral knowledge. The recurrence of protective items in every box highlights a shared belief system, demonstrating that spiritual and material practices were deeply intertwined and culturally reinforced. The locations chosen for burying the boxes were highly strategic, reflecting both practical and symbolic considerations. Archaeologists have discovered boxes hidden beneath floorboards, near hearths, in corners, and in shallow pits. Floors and corners provided concealment and reduced the risk of accidental discovery by overseers or visitors, while hearths and thresholds often held spiritual significance, serving as focal points for domestic and ritual activity. The careful selection of burial sites demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the environment, as well as a knowledge of human behavior and social dynamics within the quarter. The recurrence of similar placement strategies across multiple locations suggests a standardized approach to concealment and protection, likely informed by shared cultural knowledge transmitted through oral tradition, observation, and communal teaching. The uniformity of contents and burial methods also emphasizes the communal nature of the practice. Although each box may have been intended for individual or family use, the similarities across sites suggest that enslaved people participated in a collective system of cultural preservation and spiritual safeguarding. Knowledge of which objects to include, how to construct containers, and where to bury them appears to have been widely shared, ensuring continuity of practice across households and generations. This communal reinforcement reflects the resilience of enslaved communities, who maintained cultural cohesion and spiritual traditions despite living under extreme oppression and systematic efforts to erase their identity. The craftsmanship of the boxes themselves further illustrates the intentionality of the practice. Many were constructed from durable materials such as wood, metal, and cloth, sometimes reinforced to withstand burial, environmental conditions, and the passage of time. Objects inside were often wrapped, cushioned, or carefully arranged to preserve their integrity. This attention to construction and preservation highlights the importance of both the physical objects and their meaning. The repeated use of these methods across sites suggests that enslaved individuals shared knowledge about materials, construction techniques, and protective measures, forming a sophisticated cultural practice that blended practical skill with spiritual and symbolic consideration. The repeated selection of similar items across multiple boxes also points to the adaptability of enslaved communities in responding to their environment. Urban and rural dwellings presented very different spatial challenges, yet the essential components of the boxes remained consistent. In urban areas with limited space and higher surveillance, concealment often relied on floorboards, corners, or hidden compartments. In rural settings with larger areas and dispersed quarters, boxes might be buried in pits or under structural elements. Despite these variations, the core principles, careful selection of objects, attention to spiritual and symbolic significance, and strategic concealment, remained consistent. This adaptability demonstrates the ingenuity and resilience of enslaved populations, capable of maintaining cultural practices across diverse and often hostile environments. The psychological and social dimensions of the practice are equally significant. Creating and burying these boxes allowed enslaved individuals to assert a measure of control over their lives, maintain cultural identity, and preserve connections to family, community, and ancestry. In a context defined by physical labor, surveillance, and systemic oppression, these hidden repositories were a form of resistance, providing both practical and spiritual support. Charms and amulets offered protection, personal belongings maintained identity, and the act of concealing objects created private spaces of significance within environments that were otherwise dominated by external authority. The recurrence of similar objects and burial practices across multiple sites indicates that these acts were intentional, strategic, and deeply meaningful. The consistency of contents across multiple sites also highlights the importance of cultural memory and continuity. These hidden boxes were not temporary measures, they were intended to endure, preserving knowledge, objects, and meaning across time and space. The repeated appearance of similar objects demonstrates that enslaved communities valued continuity, teaching practices from one generation to the next and maintaining traditions despite systemic efforts to disrupt family, social networks, and cultural transmission. Each box served as a tangible link in a chain of cultural preservation, safeguarding both material and immaterial elements of identity and belief. Furthermore, the recurrence of objects across multiple boxes underscores the sophistication of enslaved individuals in blending practical, symbolic, and spiritual concern. Coins, jewelry, and personal items served practical functions, charms and ritual objects served spiritual purposes, and the careful construction and burial of the boxes addressed both practical and symbolic concern. This integration of multiple functions into a single, consistent practice reflects a nuanced understanding of survival, agency, and cultural preservation. The repeated uniformity of these practices across sites indicates a shared system of knowledge that was both resilient and adaptive, allowing enslaved people to navigate extreme conditions while maintaining identity, community, and spiritual continuity. Finally, the widespread presence of these hidden boxes across New Orleans provides a powerful testament to the ingenuity, intentionality, and resilience of enslaved communities. The repeated appearance of similar contents across multiple sites reveals a culturally embedded practice that combined personal, spiritual, and communal function. These boxes were repositories of memory, identity, protection, and hope, carefully curated to endure in both physical and symbolic terms. They offer modern scholars and observers a rare glimpse into the lives, beliefs, and survival strategies of enslaved individuals, highlighting the persistence of culture, the exercise of agency under oppression, and the deep human desire to preserve meaning in the face of adversity. These hidden boxes, discovered again and again beneath the worn floors and corners of slave quarters, are far more than forgotten relics. They are silent testimonies of resilience, ingenuity, and unyielding humanity. Each repeated coin, charm, bead, and trinket tells a story of lives lived under unimaginable oppression, yet refusing to be erased. They speak of a people who, stripped of freedom, created secret worlds of meaning, connection, and protection. They are proof that culture, memory, and belief cannot be buried as easily as objects in the ground. The consistency of the boxes, the way their contents echoed across generations, households, and neighborhoods, reveals a hidden network of shared knowledge and spiritual strength. These were acts of quiet defiance, small but profound gestures of agency, asserting identity and hope where the world sought to deny both. They were messages to the future, anchors of memory, and shields against the violence and uncertainty of the present. As we uncover these boxes today, centuries later, we are forced to confront the depth of what was lost, and yet what endured. The objects themselves, seemingly simple, carry the weight of resilience, ingenuity, and the human spirit refusing to break. Every discovery whispers of lives lived with courage and purpose, of ancestors who, even in chains, nurtured their culture, their faith, and their sense of self. In the end, the buried boxes are more than artifacts. They are a mirror reflecting the power of memory and the persistence of hope. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity finds a way to leave its mark, to protect what matters, and to endure. The people who created these boxes may have been silenced in life, but through these hidden treasures, their stories of